who will go on for about 15 minutes again. Then we'll do a group Q&A. So yeah, Melanie, without further ado, you have 15 minutes.
Great, thank you. Can you hear me okay?
Mm-hmm.
All right.
Yes.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks to all of the prior speakers who've really had some insightful talks, and the organizers for pulling this together and for allowing us to participate remotely. I know that's sometimes a challenge, so really appreciate it. I'm going to start with talking about my research, which is not directly related so much to AI or humanity, by way of sort of offering a perspective about complexity and complex systems and how that might inform this discussion. So I work at the intersection, the multiple intersections of computation and biology. I've spent many years following ants around in the desert to understand how they forage. We build models of the immune system to see how it responds to infection. Both of those examples of collective search algorithms that have evolved in nature. Then we use those to build swarms of robots, sort of examples of collective or swarm intelligence that are bio-inspired. So I'll give a couple words about those. I thought I'd start by introducing this quote by Brian Arthur, an economist who really founded the field of complexity economics, who describes complex systems, economies in particular, as one in which agents or people explore, try to make sense, react and re-react to the outcomes they together create. So in other words, it's complexity emerging from repeated, adaptive, iterative interaction among the agents, between the agents in an environment, and I think most importantly, with the adaptations and modifications that they've made to the environment, right? So they create the world they live in, and then they and we react to that world in different ways. So this slide kind of highlights some of the work we've done in bio-inspired robotics. This is me and my team out in the desert in New Mexico, watching how ants here's a little blue-dyed ant foraging in a pile of red seeds that we gave it. And we wanted to ask the question, how do the collective rules work that enable ants to communicate with each other, interact with an environment that might have a few big dense piles like this and a few more scattered piles. Ants lay pheromone trails to attract each other to food, but the specific dynamics about when those trails are reinforced to attract new ants, when they're deliberately ignored, all of those kinds of decisions allow different colonies to adapt to different environments. And so we were able to sort of recapitulate the way some of those foraging dynamics worked, and then turn those into foraging rules for swarms of robots. And we've recently taken those robots into the sky. So these are some of our aerial robots that we are now working on a volcano monitoring project. So we create flocks of these robots that will sense gas emissions from volcanoes. We work with geologists to be able to understand things about the dynamics of carbon emission from volcanic eruptions. And so all of these, in some sense, sort of touch on AI, right? We apply AI in, for example, object recognition, which works a little differently in the real world than it does with computer-generated images, or even computer images, real objects. But most of what I wanted to really sort of highlight with this work is that the interaction of agents with each other generates some sort of collective behavior that's very, very difficult to predict from the rules that the agents themselves use. It's in fact called the hard problem in swarm engineering, to figure out what are the rules I want my individual agents to follow if I want a collection of these agents to achieve some certain goal. The other side of the work that we do is in computational biology. So this is using essentially computer models, usually scaled up to large sizes, to understand something about a biological system. So this is recent work that we've done to model the spread of the SARS-CoV-2 coronavirus in the lung. And so in this case, what we did was build a fractal branching model of the lung. So this is representing the approximately 500 billion cells you have in your lung. Once we have that as a template, we can then import that into an agent-based model We look at real T cells and how they move around. These are T cells moving around in the lung of a mouse. We can incorporate those movement dynamics into the model along with the viral dynamics to predict how fast and in what sort of spatial distribution virus will spread in the lungs. And we can compare that to real CT images from real patients and kind of do a decent job recapitulating the dynamics of the virus and the growth of tissue damage in different patients under different conditions. The big take-home message from that work is that when we really consider these spatial interactions, how the virus interacts with the physical template of the lung and which cells are infectable and how they're dispersed in space, it really matters how much virus you inhale. So wearing a mask is a really good idea because if nothing else, it keeps you from inhaling large amounts of virus, which disperse through this fractal branching network in the lung. So this work is, this is where we do our real modeling work, but where I think it's relevant for this discussion, I can get my slide to advance, is in thinking about the ways that what you might consider sort of the low-level algorithm that controls the virus, how that actually has impact on the world. Right, so the SARS-CoV-2 virus, it's got 30,000 base pairs, right? It's maybe a relatively large genome for a virus, but a very small amount of data that controls its function. But what matters for how this virus spreads and the incredible impact it's had on the world is really how it interacts first at the level of human cells, right? How it interacts, for example, with T cells that are trying to kill it, with different kinds of cells in the lung, which it's trying to infect. And then at the level of the human agent who's moving through space, right, who can breathe out these kinds of aerosols that we used to think could only go 6 feet, but turns out can hang around in rooms for long periods of time. And then those humans get on transportation systems that are built by our societies, right, that allow this virus to travel in unprecedented ways, right? No virus could travel like this before among densely populated individuals that can span the globe. And so both the technologies that we've built to communicate about this virus, to fight the virus, to move ourselves around, all of these things have sort of created this ecosystem that the virus then responds to and evolves in response to. And so in some ways, some of the unprecedented evolutionary changes in the virus are a consequence, not specifically of the viral genome, but it's evolving in response to the human and societal patterns that it actually helped to create, along with human behavioral responses and institutional responses to its existence. And so I think that's an important metaphor for understanding evolution in AI and complexity in AI systems. This is an example, there's a paper, The Surprising Creativity of Digital Evolution that Joel Lehman led, that talks about these, what are often called perverse instantiations in evolutionary computation. So you evolve some computer system to do something, and there are a number of reasons it doesn't do what you want it to or what you intended. So, right, you misspecify the fitness function. Often it is unintended, debugging your system for you because you had bugs that weren't revealed until your evolutionary system evolved around those constraints, exceeded the expectations of whatever you were designing, and often these have some convergence with some systems in biology. So the upper picture there is showing a robot which took advantage of some problems in the physics simulator that it evolved in, and it's actually growing this long leg essentially and turning it into a pole, itself into a pole vaulting machine, right? And so its goal was to move quickly, and instead of running as they anticipated, right, it pole vaults around the world in the simulated world. So there's a number of, we heard earlier, the first talk, I think, about, right, these examples where you essentially cheat these video games, right, by finding these strange corner cases. Lots of these examples where you're, exploiting, evading, leveraging simulated physics in some cases, or sort of errors in the problem specification. One example that we had early on in our research, these are our iAnt robots in this picture in the lower corner. Early examples of little robots that were going around foraging for little tags we left on the floor, and they had terrible localization error. So the robots, or there's 3 robots you can see there, and 3 circles which are indicating where the robots thought they were. They were always lost, right? They had terrible localization capabilities. And so when these robots would communicate to other robots and lay a little pheromone trail saying, hey, I found food over here, they would always mislead the other robots to tell them to go to the wrong place. But when we used an evolutionary system to tune the parameters on how these robots communicated, what they actually evolved was not to communicate at all. So when robots began to sort of accidentally mislead each other due to their localization error, they evolved strategies to stop talking to one another. This is something that would be fabulous if Twitter could come up with one for us, right? So that when people are misleading the swarm, they would just be quiet. So there are a number of different examples of where sort of the unintended consequences are sort of a natural result of evolved systems. And I would argue that AI, even AI that's not explicitly evolved, in order to interact usefully in complex social environments, it's going to need to adapt to succeed. So that adaptation may happen intrinsically through some sort of evolutionary or trial and error or reinforcement learning mechanism, or it may happen through human tinkering. And I think that this is sort of the message that sort of the work that I've done sort of brings to this, is that these unintended consequences, this unpredictability that comes when you have an adaptive process of technology embedded in a larger complex system is what will lead to the unpredictability, which may be good and may be bad. And this sort of, oops, sorry about technology. So again, this reiterates that point that I think that the important impact of AI depends not so much on particular algorithms, but on the way that those algorithms leverage and cause changes in human behavior and institutional behavior that are constantly reacting and re-reacting to this system that humanity and AI are building together. An important perspective on this comes from the More is Different paper, back, I guess now 50 years old, that really talks about sort of as more and more agents interact, you get something that is qualitatively different. So when we talk about large language models that are learning based on search patterns and text responses from humans who are using other algorithms, right, and agents and AI to search, right, this feedback of these systems, I think, is actually going to create something that's quite different than any of the individual agents that were created. So I'll move on. This just wanted to talk about one example of sort of this idea of repurposing. And this is repurposed sort of, and this isn't AI, this is repurposed, very, very simple algorithm. This is the EGFR equation. This is an estimate of kidney function that has been in the news actually quite a bit recently. It's a simple regression equation that's relating various proteins in the blood, age, and sex in order to estimate the kidney function. And this equation, for a number of decades, has included a correction factor of African-American race that increases the kidney function score by about 15%. So you do everything else, and then you say, well, you would have poor kidney function, but you're African-American, and so we're actually going to say your kidney function is 15% better. And the result of this was delayed treatment of about 1 million African-Americans over these decades. Many African-Americans who died awaiting kidney transplants because their score was too high to get it. And the equation arose because of assumptions about there's an empirical pattern that African-Americans have slightly higher protein levels, and an assumption that this was due to higher muscle mass. A completely racist assumption that actually not ever been validated in data, but a sort of a biological race assumption that the algorithm exists because of an assumption that is correct and reinforces those false beliefs. There's actually a happy and in some sense to the story that there's a new race neutral equation which has recently been adopted, which is a better predictor for everyone. But the repurposing of this algorithm is to me a particularly fraught story. So of course this score is used for all sorts of medical purposes, who's eligible for chemotherapy because their kidneys are sufficiently functional, who's eligible for certain kinds of drugs. But it was also used during the COVID era because they needed to identify prisoners who were sick enough to be released from prison during the COVID crisis. And so there were several cases of this. One in particular made the New York Times, an African-American man who had a particular kidney score that would have qualified him to be released from prison if he were white, but in fact he had to stay in prison. The judge decided he needed to stay in prison because the equation with this correction said his kidney was functional enough that he was not at risk from COVID. And I think that this is not just a problem for this kind of an equation, right? This is consistent with all of the other COVID prison release bias that happened, where the most privileged, the least likely to be vulnerable, were actually disproportionately released. Over the first 2 years of the pandemic, about 16% prison population drop occurred. So although Black men are 6 times more likely to be in prison, the likelihood of being released due to COVID vulnerability was 3 times higher for white prisoners. So in a sense, this simple equation sort of characterizes these kinds of problems that we see for all sorts of different reasons. They tend to reinforce the same sort of biases over and over. So I've begun working in this space. I'm obviously working in a different sort of space in computation biology. But with Chris Moore, who's pictured here, we gathered together an interdisciplinary working group on algorithmic justice. So it's computer scientists, lawyers, and social scientists who have been working to demystify algorithms for policymakers in New Mexico, very specifically people working in criminal justice, pretrial detention, right, algorithms that determine whether or not someone can be released without bail, really trying to understand the way that transparency, audibility, and accuracy are different in the legal profession than they are in computation. Understanding ways that algorithms have been involved in housing discrimination, disparate impact, and ways that there have been actually deliberate sort of political efforts to chip away at some of the legal frameworks in the previous administration that protected against these things, specifically using algorithms. I'll talk about that a bit later. I just have a last wrap-up slide. I just wanted to mention 2 things. We held a workshop a few months ago where the title of which was "Can Algorithms Bend the Arc Toward Justice?" And we had a really spirited and productive debate in which many people thought that algorithms are actually not tools that are capable of sort of moving society in a better direction. They're inherently tools to preserve power and domination. There's a great quote that algorithms are just simply pointing us in the wrong direction. They're having us ask the wrong kinds of questions. They reify and reinforce systemic racism, stereotypes, and inequities. And sort of the idea that if algorithms aren't specifically designed to be part of the solution, that they'll simply reinforce the problems. On the other hand, we thought a lot about the role of surveillance, that is sort of using algorithms and data to reflect the bias and discrimination in systems of power, as ways to sort of hold up a mirror and identify and potentially mitigate human bias. And I think that there are some tools that are out there. There was a comment made earlier about more deliberative professions being a bit better, like lawyers and doctors being better at understanding AI. But the lawyers that we have worked with have been really afraid of the lack of understanding of AI and algorithms and what these systems can and can't do by policymakers and judges and prosecutors. And so I think there's a huge need to really sort of dig into these questions. With Melanie Mitchell, we are hoping to address some of this in an AI Research Institute. And sort of one of the big plans with that institute is to develop a course in algorithmic justice. And so this is Sonia Rankin and Kathy Powers, a law faculty and political scientists at UNM, where we're hoping to design this course. As I said, I am new to this and I would love to get input from folks here. This will be something that we're going to try to make available to the community through the SFI Complexity Explorer online platform. And so I will leave this here, and I think I'm a minute or 2 over, so we'll go to questions.
Thank you. Thanks, Melanie. Okay, I think we have about 16 minutes for questions. So I'll open it up to the floor if anybody wants to raise your hand for question.
Could we somehow get both on the screen?
Oh, that is a good question. Is there a way to get both on the screen?
Yes.
Right there.
I just have a quick question for the first speaker.
You might want to here. I'll problem.
I just had a first question for Allison. A quick question. I feel like people are kind of using sentience, cognition, and intelligence sort of interchangeably, but those don't seem to be like the same thing to me. And if you could just quickly, or share your thoughts on that. Thanks.
Thanks. Yeah. So I think none of them really apply to these cultural technologies, right? So I agree with you. I think there's really different arguments about whether a system is intelligent, whether it's sentient. Things that are very simple could be sentient, like brine shrimp, without being terribly intelligent. I think it's a big mistake when we conflate those different descriptions of what's going on. But I think the point about the cultural technologies is that none of those categories apply to them. So not only would you not say that the library is sentient, but you wouldn't say that the library was intelligent, or that the library had like if you said, who knows more, you or the Berkeley Library, right? That would just be a silly question, even though in some sense, right, there's many more pieces of knowledge in the Berkeley Library than you. So I want to do a bit of the philosophical trick about just saying it's a category mistake to think about cultural technologies as if they're in the category of agents who could be sentient or intelligent. But that's not to say that they're not important, because I think they're absolutely crucial and crucially shape human intelligence and human action, and including shaping it in lots of ways that are really ethically important. So that's the claim that I'm making. And I'm assuming everyone knows the way the large language models work, but essentially the idea is that the large language models really are just extracting patterns from big text databases. And that's, of course, just very much like what a library does, or what writing or print allow you to do. Like a library, again, you wouldn't think of a card catalog as you wouldn't ask whether it was sentient or intelligent, but I think that's closer to what something like a large language model is doing.
Okay, thanks. Let's take these two together.
Just to follow up, so I understand that you made a very good argument about the large language model is cultural technology, but there's also a distinction, because I can embed, or somebody can embed this technology inside a human form and give people the impression that it's talking to a human, which the book cannot do that. So I feel like there might be also qualitative change from the previous print form cultural technology to this large language model, right? With virtual reality, all of that. So all this technology now can be embedded in a human looking form, and that will get very different impression for a user.
Yeah, maybe I'm just being generally skeptical, but think about print from that perspective. If you read Jane Austen, for instance, who everyone loves to read, one of the points in Jane Austen is that these young women in the 18th century are going off and putting themselves in a corner with novels and thinking that the novels are real life. They're writing letters to each other. And if you think about all the history of the time when the main way that you interacted with people who were far away was by writing letters, I think you could make similar kinds of arguments about the ways that people took what were really print. That's what Socrates is saying, that people are taking what's really print, what's really a book, and treating it as if it's a message from a real person. And again, for good and for ill, that's novels are really genuinely changing the way that letters are really changing the way that people think and interact. So, of course, it could be that you could put an AI in a robot. You can send someone a letter too. I'm not convinced that's going to make a qualitative difference. And the example of misinformation is an interesting example, where there's a great deal of concern about misinformation, about things, as there should be, about things like fake news or fake videos. But of course, as soon as you have writing, as those French Revolution examples showed, you have a tremendous source of misinformation.
Let's just push back a little bit. Like the large language model we have now is interactive. You can ask questions, will come back, what the books cannot do. So yeah.
Okay. Did you still want to?
Hi, thank you for two fantastic contributions. My question is also for Alison Gopnik. So when we talk about large language models, we talk necessarily about natural language interfaces, right? So we also talk about prompt engineering, which is the term that people have chosen to talk about the design of inputs for these models. In your talk, you showed us a brief kind of like quantitative bit, right? The comparison with what children can do versus what large language models can do. So I assume there is, please feel free to just tell me to go read the paper, but I assume there is, some prompt engineering you had to do to achieve those results. At the same time, just recently, there's been studies that showed that you can introduce very specific keywords to make these models behave better, or to make them be better at certain tasks. Like you can tell GPT-3, do this, but very carefully, step by step, and it will be better at solving certain equations. So my question is, in how far are these models even testable? In how far can you take a hypothesis and verify it vis-a-vis this specific model or any large language model?
Yeah, I mean, I think the question is what happens with the prompts, and how much training do you have to do, for example, to get the systems to start producing results that look like what humans are producing. But I think the important point is, although they're interactive, what you're interacting with is something that is summarizing what a whole lot of other people have thought or reacted to in the past. And that means that the prompt engineering is going to be like the kind of prompt. I mean, again, this is just an analogy, and I'm happy to have pushback on this. But if you think about an index or a catalog, there are lots of situations in which what we're doing is doing something active that will pull out some kinds of information rather than others. And indexes or catalogs can be really different in terms of how effective they are. If you're thinking about something like trying to search through the internet, or search through books. So I think, I think we were actually a bit surprised, and interestingly, there's a couple of other results that have come out at just the same time, that this causal task, which is not terribly hard, right? I mean, which is really simple. 4-year-olds are doing it. We didn't ask for computer vision for it. It's all symbolic. We actually gave the language systems, exactly the text, in fact, more text than the kids had of the descriptions of what was going on. But I think it emphasizes the fact that this innovation, this kind of being able to go beyond the things that other people have already told us, is so central to human intelligence that I'm skeptical about whether you're going to be able, I'm sorry, I'm going on too much. That dimension is going to be the interesting dimension to look at with large language models.
Okay, so I want to move ahead because I see that there are lots of other people raising their hands. Let's do Deb and then Helen.
I had a question for the second speaker. So you were sort of talking about some of the risks associated with repurposing the algorithms, but there's been a lot of recent work on sort of how data sets are repurposed and how it's very common practice in machine learning to reuse data sets, and there's certain harms associated with that. I think like Denton et al. Kind of wrote about this at the NeurIPS dataset and benchmarks track last year. So yeah, I'm curious about your thoughts about just the differences in the risks associated with repurposing data sets versus the risks associated with repurposing algorithms and models. And if you see those differently, and if you guys are talking about the former as well, because it seems to be a lot more common in the field.
Yeah, thank you. That's a great question. In some ways, I think it's the same problem, although it's manifest in different ways, right? I mean, in some sense, some of the problems with repurposing algorithms is that they're based on data that themselves have some sort of bias, right? And this is in some sense the problem with large language models, right? The language that's there reflects, some version of people's assumptions about reality, right? So we've all seen lots of examples about, refusing to default to male nurses and female doctors and things like that. So I think that, in some sense, these are entangled problems that we can't, they're both going to operate together. The distinction between the data and the algorithm is important for people who work on data and data curation and trying to debias data versus those who are trying to verify and audit and make transparent the ways that algorithms use those data. So from a technological perspective, I think the distinction can be important. But in terms of sort of the impact of these kinds of systems on humanity, I think it's, to the prisoner who's trying to get out of jail, it to some extent doesn't matter, is it the data or the algorithm, right? That's unfairly had you convicted, those sorts of questions. I think one thing that's perhaps somewhat unique to algorithms, some of the work that we did challenging the disparate impact rules on housing. So we've written just a public comment when the previous administration attempted to design a rule. Right now, the Fair Housing Act says that you can't make lending decisions that have disparate impact, even if there's no racist intent, right? You can't essentially make decisions that redline and keep certain racial groups out of certain neighborhoods. And the attempt was made to say that, well, actually, and if a bank is using an algorithm to make this decision, you have to be able to point to the line of code in which the disparate impact occurs. Well, that's ridiculous, right? It's not a single line of code, right? It's really the interaction between, whatever algorithm, which may or may not be, available for people to audit, but the algorithm and the underlying data. And that data may reflect, reality that is in fact sort of perpetuated from historical injustices or, certain biased data sets. It's right. All of those things kind of come together to end up in a decision. So I think it's important to sort of begin to understand the ways in which both data and algorithms can really interact and in making these, really important decisions that affect people's lives and finances and freedom.
Okay, thanks. We'll do Helen.
Yeah, hi. Thank you so much to both of you. And this is a question for Melanie. Actually, I feel like there was a part of the talk that I was trying to grasp and wasn't able to. So this is kind of an elementary, please help me a little bit here, which is this idea of the problem of the unintended consequences of repurposed AI. And fast forward to the end of the talk, maybe because I'm just more familiar with some of these cases and I kind of could grasp those, but I would love you to just choose one of your the earlier cases and explain a little bit, just if you don't mind, just take me through a little bit the reasoning of how this is an instance of what you're concerned about.
Yeah, so I think, thank you for the question. I realized I tried to cram too much in. So I think that the point that I was trying to make, with the kidney example, that someone created an algorithm, right, for a medical purpose, right, and it made predictions under making a certain set of assumptions, and the predictions have a meaning in a certain context. And in a biomedical context, that probably all is consistent and at least makes some sense, even if there are errors in it. When that algorithm then is sort of repurposed to say, oh, well, we're going to use this sort of health outcome to make predictions about who's healthy enough, right, to be released or not released, because sicker patients should be released under this COVID protocol. The idea there is that now the algorithm has societal level consequences that, the doctors making this kidney prediction sort of didn't have on their radar. It's in some sense inherent to the algorithm wherever it's applied, in that there was this underlying, now debunked sort of theory of racial differences in muscle mass that actually was underlying the reason that African Americans were specifically highlighted and had this different kidney score. But the impact of that is not just medical, right? It then falls into this societal domain. Where it actually is part of, the exacerbated and the differential imprisonment of African Americans, right? It's a tiny little, it's a infinitesimally small slice of that particular kind of bias. But I guess I was trying to get at the fact that these algorithms give this illusion of objectivity, that because it's a mathematical formula that gives you a number, it can be taken from one context and used in another. And I think that's very similar to the ways we use proxies. For example, some of the work that we've done that you're probably somewhat familiar with, the Arnold tool, which is one of these prisoner release or prisoner risk assessment tools, right? It's an open tool. It's very simple. You put in data and it makes a prediction about the likelihood that someone will appear for their trial. And in that sense, it's a repurposing of data. The tool was trained on data from Kentucky, but it's now used in states all over the country. And we did some analysis that said, you know what, it actually has differential impact among different racial groups in different states, right? So it may underestimate or overestimate, Hispanic versus Black versus white prisoners in Kentucky versus New Mexico. In that case, it's sort of a repurposing of the algorithm, assuming that the underlying patterns which were predictive in one place hold and are predictive in another. So I think that's a different version of repurposing the algorithm just by applying it to a new population. And to me, that's sort of the danger, is sort of this idea that when you have an algorithm, whether it's fancy AI, something that gives you something that's purported to be an objective number, but in fact is really laden with the context of the problem you started with, that you'll get unintended consequences, and that those amplify because those consequences are embedded in a criminal justice system or a financial system that already has existing biases.
Thank you. Please, I more. I know here.
Hi. Thank you very much to the two speakers. My question is for Melanie as well. I like the phrase that you had up on your slide that was the algorithms pointing in the wrong direction. And I wanted to ask what it would mean to put the algorithm to work in the other direction, or the direction that you think it should be facing. And I'm thinking about this through the work of a scholar like Wendy Chun, where she's using, say, the example of Amazon's hiring tool that disproportionately downgraded women when it was assessing like who should get hired here. And it was like, if you went to a historically women's college, then you were downgraded. If you just had the word woman in your CV, then you was like downgraded like woman's chess champion or something, right? And she was, and for her, she's like, they should be put to work not in a role that is in prediction around what happens next, but they're most useful in telling us what happened before. So we could perhaps use an algorithm as, say, a material witness to provide evidence of discrimination that we previously had not had the evidence to do so. So it was sort of the outcome of that. Like it was a horrible thing, and it showed us sort of something that we didn't want to see, and it's forms of injustice and discrimination that we didn't want to see. But it actually was incredibly useful because it finally provided evidence for so many of us who, say, have only felt that discrimination sort of broadly and have never had the means to prove it. And here we have something that can help us prove it. So that's one question I had for you. And the second was actually more around the proxies. And I wanted to ask if you could just talk more about how race is proxified within, the movement from repurposing from one context to another. Thank you very much.
Great.
We'll take this one as well.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you both. My question is for Alison, and it's just maybe this is something that I should just read in your work, and I'm really curious to read that. But I guess I'm just wondering if you have a sense in which the changing media environment has to be analytically parsed, right? And I guess this kind of comes to the conversation you were having earlier. I suppose I'm just thinking about the way in which different media take on different roles in terms of authority, and also the way that they collapse time and couple together time in different ways. And I think those two things are interestingly connected, like the way that in a pre-print written culture, books were incredibly sacred and they were the authority, but they were also very slow to make and to read. And with print, that authority is undone because suddenly everybody can read multiple books and get multiple possible selections. But again, they have time to read and to think through, and you can see the working. And with a book, you can always stop reading and you can walk away, which you can't really do if you're talking to Socrates. So it seems in that particular idea of time, maybe one of the things about LLM models as a medium is that they collapse time and they are opaque in their working. and that might, I'm just curious in your research with children, you know, I mean, are they sort of getting faster, right? Or are they developing heuristics for responding to this system that kind of demands a response before there's any time to really understand what's happened? And that's something I think about a lot in relation to the authority of media, I guess.
Yeah, I think that's, sorry, Melanie, why don't you go? There was something I wanted to mention, and actually in relation to the question that was asked Melanie, which is, I think this, and this is related to time as well, I think it's a really important, interesting point that what these cultural technologies do is summarize the past and not predict the future. That's exactly the difference between imitation and innovation, is that when you, even a marvelous library tells you what everybody's thought and found before, it doesn't give you a sense of what the space of possibility is for the future. And ethics is all about the space of possibility for the future. That's how we make our ethical decisions, are all about what do we do next? What's the space of potential possibilities? And I think that it's very important to convey that for something like a large language model that might give the illusion of enabling you to say something about the future, whereas what it's really doing is just telling you something about what happened in the past, and then you take that information and then you can decide what the space of possibilities for the future is like. But sorry, Melanie.
Thanks. That's a great way to put that. So quickly, I guess the point about the algorithms pointed in the wrong direction. This was actually a really fascinating, heated debate, very productive, that we had during our workshop. That, the Amazon example is one that I use a lot. That certainly some good came from that, right? Of algorithms that could really document, these are the past practices, the bias that's already existed, and the algorithm can make that clear, right? In that case, the AI. The point that, the sort of counterpoint to that is, well, but Amazon owned that, right? Amazon made the decision to reveal that was what was going on, and that was a good, helpful thing, but they didn't have to. And I think the fear is that if the other example that's often pointed to as very helpful is police body cams, right? So that's data that should be reflecting, the actions of sort of the powerful, and certainly algorithms could be used to glean something from that data, but the police sort of control the data, right? And we've just seen this in Uvalde, right? Whether the video is released and when it is released and that sort of thing is still in the hands of the powerful. And so I think the concern is that even though these tools can be sort of turned to provide a mirror, to reflect what's going on and allow us to react to it, who has the power to decide when that information is released, who gets to see it, those sorts of things. So I think that the key sort of concern, and I'm not sure that it's, how much it is the dominant concern. The key concern is that these are tools that really will still be, tools of the powerful that will still, in some sense, control those with less power. And so that's sort of the perspective of a lot of the political scientists, or the civil rights activists who were involved in this workshop. That's not to say that they aren't useful in many cases, right? In terms of proxies, I think that, in some cases, some proxies are not allowed. But there are always sort of racial proxies that lurk. So for example, in prison release, some of the racial proxies are things like, putting together arrest record of yourself, your family, your juvenile record, all of these things that tend to accumulate in some communities more than others. Those sorts of, so that, any of these tools that gather a huge amount of data, almost certainly you can identify race without asking what someone's race is, right? So even if algorithms are not allowed to use race to predict, likelihood to recommit a crime, all of these other factors are highly correlated with race. And in fact, then we can sort of perpetuate that bias. So I think that in some sense, the algorithms aren't the problem is the underlying data and the underlying sort of structure of society that the algorithms reify and reinforce in some cases. And even if the data are accurate reflections of what happens in society, I think that the fear is that algorithms just take that data and actually we do in fact use them to predict the future from the past, even though that isn't sort of fair use of reporting on what the past has been.
Okay, thank you. Oh, sorry. I guess we're pretty much out of time. Allison, did you have a brief response?
Yeah, maybe this is a good summary with both Melanie and my response, which is I don't want it at all to suggest that this is somehow, discounting the problems with using these new systems. I think the history is that, and this is also relevant to the question that was just asked about time. I think each time that you have a new technology, and in particular, each time you have a new version of a cultural technology, it's going to raise new possibilities for harm that you would not have anticipated beforehand. So, the possibilities for harm for books are different from pamphlets, are different from television, are different from internet, are different from large language models. And what you have to do is pay attention to here's what's happening with this technology. Here's what we knew from the past. Here's how it's allowing us or misleading us about our access to past information, and then start this process of, which again is sort of the whole point of the innovation, start this process of innovating new techniques both within and outside of the systems themselves that can have this kind of ratcheting effect that seems to be part of cultural evolution as well. There's no guarantee that it won't end up incredibly badly. I mean, it could end up incredibly badly, but there's also no guarantee that there's no guarantee that it will end up incredibly badly. And this process of producing new norms, new institutions seems to be the way to go forward with it.
Okay, thank you. We'll stop it there. So let's thank our speakers again, Allison and Melanie. This concludes our regularly scheduled programming for today. We do have, would you like to say anything, Helen, about the plans for tonight or tomorrow?
Well, the speakers want to wait about more time. And see you back here tomorrow. What else?
Yeah, there's nothing else to say.
Yes, just to thank everyone who's been sitting in the room and contributing with great ideas and creating. I don't know, Sonia's not here, but in my view, more than the sum of the parts.
Okay, thanks again, guys.
Thank you.